Okay, let's talk about layout. In CSS, we now have choices. Up until very recently, the only choice we had for building layouts was float or using something really old, which is HTML tables. Not a good choice. So now that we've got Flexbox and CSS Grids, we can build layouts using any of the three different methods. Float is probably the most complicated and the most error-prone of the three. That's why it was replaced with Flex and Grid. So let's just look at these three examples doing the exact same thing with just slightly different CSS. Then you'll see that you can really build layouts with any of the three. Okay, so the HTML that I have here is the exact same 3 times over. If we look at the page, here it is. I have a div inside of which there's a main and 2 sections. It's the exact same thing 3 times. The only difference is the class name at the top. So I called the first one Flexy, the second one Griddy, and the third one Floaty. We have these 3 classes so that we can target the 3 different portions. Okay, so let's come up to the, well, let's start at the bottom one, Floaty. So with Floaty, this is the one where we're using CSS Float. Margin overflow set to auto. This is something I have to add in Float because if you want to have a background that goes behind all the elements, but there's elements inside of your container that are floated, it means the browser ignores the height. The whole purpose of Float was to be able to put an image and then make stuff wrap around it. The only way you could make stuff wrap around it was by ignoring its height, so it didn't hold open a single line. So like here, I've got lorem ipsum. If I were to put an image in front of this lorem ipsum, or in place of this lorem ipsum text right here, the image wants to fit on the same line as the rest of this text. So it stretches open this one single line, holding it open. So if you want to make everything else fit there, you have to tell it, okay, ignore how tall that thing is. Let's just look at the height of these lines. Because you do that, it meant that if you were putting in borders, if you were putting in backgrounds, it wouldn't include the height of this when it was drawing the border, when it was putting in the background. So you often ended up with these uneven things or elements with no backgrounds. The quick fix for that was to come in and add overflow auto. That way, the border and the background would show up around your floated element. Okay, we've got background color in the main, we've got background color and padding on the 2 sections. So first and last, these are just to target the 2 of them. I'm floating one of them left, I'm floating one of them right. I could have floated both of them left or both of them right. It wouldn't have made much difference. Width, 50%. That's all I'm doing. So I'm saying float the section, give it a width of 50%. That's really what's building the layout here. And then the second one, float it right and give it 50%. So now these 2 elements, these 2 sections right here, the blue and the green, will sit side by side and they'll take up 50% of the width of the entire container. And that's it, that's float. Now, the downfall of using float is that inside of here, if we were to add in a whole bunch more text in one of them, there we are, and I'll paste that bit of text in. This is what happens. You don't have the same height on these 2 child elements. That's the downfall of float. There were all kinds of hacky ways that you could fix this, but if the content was the same size, it was easy to make them sit here and look identical. So that is the downfall of float, and that's why we're moving on to grid and flex. So if you're building layout now, don't bother with the float. Use float to wrap text around images. That's really what it's best for. So next, grid. Moving up to our div with the class Griddy, we'll come up here. Display grid. We're defining grid template columns. 1 free space and 1 free space. So there's 2 columns we're creating here. And inside those 2 columns, the easiest way to do this, I find, is to define the areas. So I'm going to have at the very top A and A. So whatever I define as A is going to fill both columns in the first row. My second row, B and C. So there'll be 3 things one called A, one called B, one called C, and they'll fill up space, the whole row, half the row, and half the row. Come down here. A is the main. And then my two sections, they've got the names B and C. So these are these guys right here. So here's the blue, here's the green. This is B, this is C. The green is C, the blue is B. And A is the one that fills up both columns. And that's it. So we've got the same layout. You want to make two columns. And if you want to change the width here, well, okay, let's break this up slightly differently. We'll say that 1 and 3. This is the fraction that I'm going to use. Or 1 and 2. So if I add them together, I get a total of 3. So this will be 2/3, and this will be 1/3. 1 over 3, 2 over 3. Now I have to define two columns, which I've done. So A is still filling them both. B is going to fill up this first one. C is going to fill up the second one. There we are. Very easy to change this. If I was going to do this inside of float, down here, okay, well, we can say 33.333%, and this one's going to be 66.6667%. There we are. So here's the same effect, but again, we don't have the even heights. Here, Grid is doing that for us. It's solving the fact that we want to have a different height. And then our final example with Flexbox. There we are. Display flex, flex wrap, allow the wrapping. So when you say display flex, it by default wants to say no wrap. I'm going to treat everything that you give me as if it's one row or one column. The default is one row. So flex direction here, even though I haven't set it, is the default. So flex direction is set to row, because that's the default. And I'm saying it's okay to wrap. It's okay to jump to the next. When you run out of space, go to the next line. And we triggered that by the first element, the main element, by setting flex basis 100%. So we're saying the width of that main is 100% of whatever the parent container is up here. So this parent container is 100% of the width. Then the sections, both of them, I don't have to say which one, both of them are now 50%. That's their flex basis. So they get 50% of the width. And that's it. So there's Flexbox. Now if I wanted to do the same thing, I wanted to do 1/3 and 2/3 for the size of this column. Now I'm going to have to come in here and say same thing as I did for float, 33.333. And the last child, I will overwrite that value, and I will say that the flex basis for the last child is going to be 66.6667%. There we go. And now we've got that same layout. And there it is. There's Flexbox, Grid, and Float. Flexbox and Grid, they're doing the same sort of thing, but I think you can see that it's a little bit more flexible. It's a little easier to work with Grid. If you're talking about two-dimensional layouts, use a CSS Grid. If you're talking about a single row or a single column, Flex works really well. Flex is great for lining up elements inside of a form, building a nav bar, things like that. You want to build your whole page layout? I would choose CSS Grid as my first option. All right, great. So hopefully that helps you understand the differences between Flex, Grid, and Float. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. If you found this useful, please share it. And as always, thanks for watching.